Marcus Rivera never imagined that standing up for a shy 12-year-old girl would transform his entire world. What started as a simple act of kindness outside Jefferson Middle School would lead to a discovery so extraordinary that it would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, privilege, and the unexpected connections that can change a life forever. The quiet girl he defended wasn't just another student being picked on by bullies. She was the granddaughter of one of the most influential families in the country, and his intervention was about to open doors he never knew existed while testing his integrity in ways he never anticipated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Jefferson Middle School's parking lot as Marcus Rivera adjusted his rearview mirror and checked the time on his phone. 3:15. His daughter Emma would be walking out any minute now, her backpack slung over one shoulder and that familiar expression of relief that came with surviving another day of 7th grade. Marcus had been picking Emma up from school for the past 3 years, ever since his wife Linda passed away in a car accident that shattered their small family into pieces that he was still trying to put back together. The construction job he'd managed to land after months of unemployment paid just enough to keep their modest apartment in Riverside Heights. But it meant early mornings and dirty hands and the constant worry that one missed day of work could send them spiraling back into the financial hole they'd barely climbed out of. Still, Marcus made it a point to be here every afternoon at 3:15 sharp. Emma needed that consistency, that assurance that no matter how chaotic the world became, her father would be waiting for her when the final bell rang. Today felt different somehow, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on why. Maybe it was the way the clouds had been gathering all afternoon, promising a storm that would wash the dust from the construction site off his work boots. Maybe it was the letter from the landlord that had arrived that morning, reminding him that rent was due in 5 days and suggesting in politely threatening language that late payments were becoming a concerning pattern. Or maybe it was simply the exhaustion that had been building in his bones for months. The weight of being both mother and father to a 13-year-old girl who was navigating her own complicated world of middle school politics and teenage emotions. Marcus rolled down his window and breathed in the familiar scent of autumn leaves and diesel exhaust from the school buses idling in the pickup lane. Other parents sat in their cars, some scrolling through their phones, others chatting with friends who had pulled up beside them. He recognized most of the faces by now, though he rarely joined in the casual conversations that seemed to flow so easily between the other mothers and fathers. It wasn't that he was unfriendly exactly. It was more that he felt the invisible barrier that separated him from the families who drove newer cars and wore clothes that didn't bear the permanent stains of manual labor. The first wave of students began streaming out of the building, a chaotic mix of laughter and shouting and the metallic clang of locker doors slamming shut. Marcus scanned the crowd for Emma's familiar red hair, his eyes automatically filtering through the sea of young faces until he spotted her near the bike racks. She was walking with her best friend Jenna, both girls animated in the way that suggested they were discussing something of vital importance to their 12-year-old worlds. But as Marcus watched, his attention was drawn to a commotion near the edge of the school grounds. A group of older boys, 8th graders by the look of them, had surrounded someone near the chain-link fence that separated the school property from the residential street beyond. Marcus couldn't see who was in the center of their circle, but he could hear the edge of cruelty in their voices even from this distance, that particular tone that kids used when they were testing the boundaries of how much pain they could inflict before an adult intervened. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand on the door handle. This wasn't his business. He wasn't a teacher or a school administrator. He was just a parent waiting to pick up his daughter, and getting involved in schoolyard disputes wasn't his responsibility. But something about the scene nagged at him, a familiar knot of recognition in his stomach that took him back to his own childhood, to the times when he'd been the one surrounded by kids who had decided that his worn-out shoes or his free lunch status made him a target worth tormenting. The decision was made for him when one of the boys, a tall kid with an expensive-looking jacket, raised his hand as if to push whoever was in the center of their circle. Marcus was out of his truck and walking across the parking lot before he fully realized he'd moved, his work boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the group. "Hey!" he called out, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of managing construction crews and dealing with difficult situations. "What's going on here?" The boys turned toward him, their expressions shifting from predatory excitement to wary calculation. The tall one in the expensive jacket stepped back slightly, but there was still defiance in his posture, the kind of arrogance that suggested he wasn't used to being challenged by adults. "Nothing," the boy said, his voice carrying a practiced innocence that didn't quite hide the underlying hostility. "We're just talking to Isabella here, right, Isabella?" Marcus looked past the boys and saw her then, the girl they'd been surrounding. She was small for what he guessed was probably 7th or 8th grade, with dark hair that fell in waves around her face and eyes that seemed too old for someone her age. Her school uniform was immaculate, every detail perfect, from her polished shoes to the way her backpack straps were adjusted to the exact same length. But there was something in her posture, a careful stillness that spoke of someone who had learned to make herself as invisible as possible. She didn't answer the boy's question, didn't even look up from the ground where her gaze had been fixed. Since Marcus approached, there was a small tear in her white blouse, just above the school crest, and Marcus noticed the way her hands were clenched into small fists at her sides. "Isabella, is it?" Marcus said gently, crouching down slightly so he could meet her eyes. "Are you okay?" For a moment, she still didn't respond. Then slowly, she lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and there was a guardedness in them that reminded Marcus of a wounded animal that had learned not to trust human kindness. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," she said, but the words carried no conviction. The tall boy in the expensive jacket laughed, a sound that held no humor. "See, she's fine. Isabella's always fine, aren't you, Isabella? Even when she's too weird to talk to anyone. Even when she thinks she's better than everyone else because of her fancy clothes and her perfect grades." "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice hardening. He stood to his full height, which put him several inches above the tallest of the boys. "Whatever this is, it's over now." The boy's eyes narrowed. "You can't tell us what to do. You're not a teacher." "No," Marcus agreed, "but I am an adult, and I'm telling you that this conversation is finished. These other kids need to get home, and I'm sure you do too." For a moment, the standoff continued. Marcus could feel the tension crackling in the air between them, the way the boy was weighing his options, trying to decide if challenging this unknown adult was worth whatever consequences might follow. Around them, other students had begun to notice the confrontation, some stopping to watch, while others hurried past with the practiced avoidance of kids who had learned not to get involved in other people's problems. Finally, the boy shrugged, with calculated nonchalance. "Whatever, we were done here anyway." He looked back at Isabella, and there was something in his expression that suggested this wasn't over, that whatever had been happening here was part of a longer story that wouldn't end just because some stranger had intervened. "See you tomorrow, Isabella. Maybe you'll be more talkative then." The group dispersed slowly, reluctantly, like predators being driven away from a kill they weren't quite finished with. Marcus watched them go, noting the way they looked back over their shoulders, the way they whispered among themselves as they walked toward the bus line. These weren't kids who would forget this intervention, and he had a feeling that Isabella would pay for his interference in ways he couldn't predict or prevent. When they were gone, Marcus turned back to the girl. She was still standing in the same spot, still holding herself with that careful stillness, but now she was looking at him with something that might have been gratitude mixed with fear. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, gentler this time. Isabella glanced around, as if checking to make sure they were truly gone, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was stronger now, though still quiet. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did," Marcus said simply. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not by a bunch of kids who think they can get away with it because adults aren't watching." Something flickered across Isabella's face at that, an expression too complex for Marcus to read. She adjusted her backpack straps with precise movements, smoothing down her uniform skirt and checking that her school ID badge was properly positioned. Everything about her suggested someone who had been taught that appearances mattered, that the smallest detail out of place could invite scrutiny or judgment. "I should go," she said, looking past Marcus toward the street. "My driver will be worried." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Driver. The word registered with Marcus, along with several other details he'd been too focused on the confrontation to notice before. The girl's uniform wasn't just neat, it was expensive, the kind of quality that spoke of private school tuition and family money. Her backpack, while standard issue for Jefferson Middle School, was monogrammed with initials that had been embroidered in gold thread. Her shoes, despite being regulation black, were clearly designer, the kind that cost more than Marcus made in a week. "Your driver?" Marcus asked, not because he didn't believe her, but because the pieces of this puzzle weren't fitting together in any way that made sense. Jefferson Middle School was a public school in a working-class neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of place where kids arrived in cars with drivers. Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly, as if she'd said something she shouldn't have. "I mean, my grandfather's driver. He picks me up sometimes when grandfather is working late." Before Marcus could ask any more questions, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, so quiet that he hadn't heard it approaching. The windows were tinted dark enough that Marcus couldn't see inside, but there was something about the vehicle that screamed money and power in a way that made him instinctively uncomfortable. This wasn't just an expensive car. It was the kind of car that came with its own security detail and diplomatic immunity. The driver's door opened, and a man in a crisp black suit stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that suggested military or law enforcement background. His eyes swept the scene with professional efficiency, taking in Marcus, Isabella, and the lingering groups of students with the practiced assessment of someone trained to identify potential threats. "Miss Isabella," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't place. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Carlos," Isabella replied. But Marcus noticed the way her voice changed when she spoke to the driver, becoming more formal, more carefully modulated. "This gentleman was just helping me with something." Carlos turned his attention to Marcus, and for a moment Marcus felt like he was being X-rayed, every detail of his appearance catalogued and filed away for future reference. The man's gaze lingered on Marcus's work clothes, his calloused hands, the dust on his boots, but there was no judgment in his expression, just professional curiosity. "I appreciate your assistance," Carlos said, stepping forward with one hand extended. His handshake was firm, but not aggressive, the greeting of someone who had been trained in diplomacy as much as security. "Isabella is very important to her, her family." There was something in the way he said it, a weight that suggested layers of meaning Marcus wasn't equipped to understand. But before he could ask any questions, Isabella was already moving toward the car, her small frame seeming even smaller next to the imposing vehicle. "Thank you again," she said to Marcus, pausing with her hand on the car door. For just a moment, her carefully composed mask slipped, and he saw something vulnerable in her expression, something that reminded him of Emma during those first terrible months after Linda's death. "Really? Thank you." Then she was sliding into the back seat of the sedan, and Carlos was closing the door behind her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. He nodded once more to Marcus, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and dismissal before returning to the driver's seat. Marcus watched the car pull away, noting the way it moved through traffic with the smooth authority of a vehicle that never had to wait for red lights or worry about parking tickets. Within moments, it had disappeared around the corner, leaving him standing on the sidewalk with more questions than answers, and the growing realization that he had just stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple case of schoolyard bullying. "Dad?" Emma's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see his daughter approaching with a puzzled expression. "What are you doing over here?" "I was waiting by the truck." Marcus blinked, suddenly aware that he'd completely forgotten why he was here in the first place. "Sorry, sweetheart. I was just helping someone out." Emma looked around, taking in the empty sidewalk and the lingering groups of students who were still watching Marcus with curious expressions. "Helping? Who?" "A girl who was having some trouble with some bullies," Marcus said, starting to walk back toward his truck. "Nothing major." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't true. Nothing about what had just happened felt minor or insignificant. The girl, Isabella, carried herself like someone accustomed to a level of privilege that most people could only imagine. Yet she was attending a public school in one of the more modest neighborhoods in the city. The car that had picked her up cost more than Marcus would make in 5 years, yet she'd been standing alone while a group of kids tormented her with the casual cruelty that came so naturally to adolescence. As they drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside Heights, Marcus found himself thinking about the encounter, trying to piece together the fragments of information he'd gathered. Isabella's perfect uniform and expensive accessories suggested wealth, but there had been something almost desperate in her gratitude, as if kindness from strangers was a rare commodity in her life. The driver, Carlos, had treated her with the kind of professional respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or corporate executives, yet she was just a middle school student who should have been worried about homework and friends, not whatever complex family dynamics required armed drivers and diplomatic courtesy. Emma chatted about her day as they drove, telling him about a pop quiz in math class and drama involving her friend group that seemed monumentally important to her 13-year-old perspective. Marcus listened with half his attention, making the appropriate sounds of interest and concern, while his mind continued to puzzle over the afternoon's events. It wasn't until they were pulling into their apartment complex that Emma said something that made him focus completely on her words. "Oh, I forgot to tell you," she said, gathering her backpack from the floor of the truck. "There's this weird girl in my grade who never talks to anyone. Isabella something. Some of the 8th graders are always picking on her, calling her stuck-up and weird. I felt kind of bad for her today because I saw them following her after school, but I didn't know what to do about it." Marcus turned in his seat to look at his daughter. "You know her?" "Not really," Emma said with a shrug. "She's in my English class, but she never says anything unless the teacher calls on her. She's really smart, though, like scary smart. She always knows the answers to everything, even the stuff we haven't covered yet. Some of the kids think she's showing off, but I think she's just naturally good at school." "Have you ever tried talking to her?" Emma looked uncomfortable. Once, at the beginning of the year, I asked her if she wanted to sit with me and my friends at lunch, but she just said no thank you and walked away. It was weird. Most kids would at least explain why they couldn't sit with you, but she just left. After that, I figured she wanted to be left alone. Marcus nodded slowly, filing away this additional information. It painted a picture of a girl who was isolated not just from the bullies who targeted her, but from potential friends who might have offered her the social connections that could have protected her from harassment. The question was whether that isolation was chosen or imposed, whether Isabella was deliberately keeping herself apart from her classmates, or whether there were forces at work that made normal teenage friendships impossible. Their apartment was on the third floor of a converted building that had seen better days, with stairs that creaked under their weight and hallways that always smelled faintly of cooking oil and cleaning products. It wasn't much, but it was home, and Marcus had worked hard to make it a place where Emma could feel safe and loved, despite the chaos that had upended their lives 3 years ago. The living room was small but comfortable, with a couch he'd bought, second-hand, and a television that was older than Emma but still functional. Family photos lined the mantel above their electric fireplace, pictures of happier times when Linda was still alive, and their biggest worry was whether they could afford a vacation to the beach that summer. While Emma settled in at the kitchen table to start her homework, Marcus made dinner from whatever was left in their refrigerator, stretching ingredients into a meal that would fill them both up without breaking the budget he maintained with mathematical precision. Pasta with tomato sauce and some frozen vegetables wasn't gourmet cuisine, but it was nutritious and affordable, and Emma had learned not to complain about the repetitive nature of their meals. As they ate, Marcus found himself thinking again about Isabella and the stark contrast between her obvious wealth and her apparent loneliness. He'd grown up poor himself, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. He knew what it felt like to be different from his classmates, to be aware that his clothes came from thrift stores and his lunch came from the free meal program. But at least he'd had friends, kids in similar situations, who understood the particular challenges that came with poverty. Isabella seemed to exist in a category all her own, too wealthy to relate to the working-class kids who made up the majority of Jefferson Middle School student body, yet somehow still vulnerable to the kind of casual cruelty that usually targeted the weakest members of the social hierarchy. After dinner, while Emma worked on her homework at the kitchen table, Marcus sat on the couch with his laptop, paying bills and reviewing his bank account with the grim focus of someone who had learned that financial security was a luxury he couldn't afford to take for granted. The construction job provided steady income, but it was just enough to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and Emma's basic needs. There was no room for emergencies or unexpected expenses, no cushion that would allow him to miss work if he got sick or if Emma needed something that wasn't in the budget. He was in the middle of calculating whether he could afford to get his truck's brakes checked when Emma appeared beside the couch, her math homework in her hand, and a frustrated expression on her face. "I don't understand this problem," she said, pointing to a complex equation that looked like hieroglyphics to Marcus. "Mrs. Patterson explained it in class, but I still don't get it." Marcus looked at the problem and felt the familiar frustration that came with wanting to help his daughter, but lacking the educational background to do so effectively. He'd graduated from high school, but barely, and his knowledge of advanced mathematics was limited to the practical applications he used in construction work. Emma was smart, smarter than he'd ever been in school, but she was reaching the point where her academic needs were beyond his ability to support. "Let me see if I can figure it out," he said, taking the worksheet and studying the problem with the kind of intense concentration he usually reserved for reading blueprints. After several minutes of struggle, He managed to work through the logic, though he wasn't entirely confident in his explanation. Emma listened patiently as he walked her through his reasoning, but he could see the doubt in her expression, the growing awareness that her father's help with homework was becoming less reliable as her classes became more challenging. It was a reminder of all the ways that poverty created disadvantages that went beyond simple material needs, how the lack of educational resources and support could compound across generations. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus stood at his bedroom window looking out at the city lights that sparkled in the distance, like promises of opportunities he couldn't quite reach. Somewhere out there, Isabella was probably living, in a world of privilege and comfort that he could barely imagine. Yet she was facing challenges that money apparently couldn't solve. The irony wasn't lost on him, that while he struggled to provide Emma with basic educational support, there was a girl across town who had access to every possible advantage, yet seemed to be drowning in isolation and loneliness. He thought about Linda, who had always been better at understanding the emotional complexities of Emma's world, who would have known instinctively how to help a child like Isabella without overstepping boundaries or making assumptions. Linda had possessed an intuitive wisdom about people that Marcus had always admired but never quite mastered himself. She would have found a way to reach out to the girl without making her uncomfortable, would have understood the delicate balance between offering help and respecting privacy. But Linda was gone, and Marcus was left to navigate these complicated waters alone, guided only by his own imperfect instincts and the memories of what it had felt like to be a kid who needed an adult to stand up for him. He'd done the right thing that afternoon, he was sure of that, but he also had the nagging feeling that his intervention had been just the beginning of something larger, that the simple act of defending a bullied child had set in motion a chain of events whose consequences he couldn't predict. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, with the kind of persistent mist that made everything look slightly out of focus. Marcus was up before his alarm, the way he'd been every day since Linda's death, his internal clock calibrated to worry and responsibility in ways that made sleeping past 5:30 nearly impossible. He made coffee in the kitchen while Emma got ready for school, listening to her moving around her bedroom with the efficient routine they'd developed over 3 years of managing their morning schedule without a mother's organizational skills. The construction site where Marcus worked was located downtown, about 20 minutes from Emma's school, if traffic cooperated. He'd been fortunate to land the job with Rivera Construction, a family-owned company that specialized in residential renovation projects. The pay wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, and the owner, Miguel Rivera, was a decent man who understood that Marcus had responsibilities beyond work that sometimes required flexibility in his schedule. Marcus arrived at the job site early, as was his habit, and spent the first hour of his day reviewing the plans for the Victorian house they were restoring. The project was ambitious, transforming a deteriorating 19th century mansion into luxury condominiums for buyers who could afford to pay premium prices for historical character combined with modern amenities. It was the kind of work that Marcus found satisfying, the careful balance of preserving architectural integrity while updating systems and layouts to meet contemporary needs. His crew began arriving around 7, a mix of experienced carpenters and younger workers who were still learning the trade. Marcus had been promoted to foreman 6 months ago, a recognition of his skill and reliability that came with additional responsibility, but only a modest increase in pay. He took pride in running an efficient operation, ensuring that work progressed on schedule while maintaining the safety standards that could mean the difference between going home whole at the end of the day and ending up in the emergency room. The morning passed quickly, consumed by the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, and fitting pieces of wood into the complex puzzle of renovation work. Marcus was installing crown molding in what would eventually be a luxury bedroom when his phone buzzed with a text message. He almost ignored it, focused on the precise angles required to make the decorative trim fit perfectly, but something made him pause and check the screen. The message was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood run cold. "Thank you for yesterday. Those boys found me again this morning. I didn't know who else to tell." Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications. Isabella had somehow gotten his phone number and was reaching out to him about continued harassment. The text suggested that his intervention yesterday had not only failed to solve the problem, but had potentially made it worse, escalating a situation he'd thought he was helping to resolve. He quickly typed back, "Are you safe right now? Do you need me to call someone?" The response came almost immediately. "I'm in the nurse's office. They didn't hurt me, just cornered me before school and said some things. I'll be okay, but I wanted you to know that it's not over." Marcus felt a surge of anger, both at the boys who were continuing to target Isabella and at himself for naively thinking that a single confrontation would solve a complex social dynamic. Bullying rarely ended with one adult intervention. It usually just shifted tactics or locations, finding new ways to torment victims while avoiding detection by authority figures. He typed back, "Have you told any teachers or administrators what's happening? It wouldn't help. They're all friends with important families. I just have to endure it until I can transfer schools." The response revealed layers of complexity that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Isabella's situation wasn't just about typical middle school social dynamics. It was complicated by issues of power and influence that extended far beyond the school grounds. The boys who were harassing her apparently had protection that came from family connections, the kind of social immunity that money and status could purchase in communities where reputation and relationships mattered more than justice. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He wanted to help Isabella, but he was also acutely aware of his own limitations. He was a construction worker with no special training in dealing with bullying situations, no connections to the school administration, and no understanding of the family dynamics that seemed to be driving the conflict. Getting more involved could potentially make things worse for Isabella while also creating problems for his own family. But the image of the girl standing alone while a group of boys surrounded her, the memory of the careful way she held herself as if preparing for blows that might come at any moment, made it impossible for him to simply ignore her plea for help. He thought about Emma, about how he would want some adult to intervene if she were being targeted by bullies, about the responsibility that came with being in a position to make a difference in a child's life. He typed back, "I'm going to make some phone calls. Don't give up hope." Then he stepped away from his work and called the school's main office, asking to speak with a counselor or administrator about a bullying situation. The conversation that followed was frustrating in its bureaucratic limitations, filled with assurances that the school took all reports seriously, while making it clear that without specific details and formal complaints, there was little that could be done. The counselor he spoke with was sympathetic but constrained by policies that required documentation and parental involvement. Procedures that seemed designed more to protect the institution than to help individual students. After hanging up, Marcus realized that his options for helping Isabella through official channels were limited. The school's hands were tied by regulations and liability concerns, and Isabella's own family situation was apparently too complicated for simple solutions. But giving up wasn't an option either, not when a child was reaching out to him for help that she couldn't get anywhere else. He spent the rest of the morning working with distracted intensity, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind wrestled with the problem of how to help a girl he barely knew who was trapped in circumstances he didn't fully understand. The solution, when it came to him, was so simple that he wondered why he hadn't thought of it immediately. During his lunch break, Marcus drove to Jefferson Middle School and parked across the street from the main entrance. He wasn't sure exactly what he planned to do, but he figured that his presence during dismissal time might serve as a deterrent to any students who were planning to continue harassing Isabella. If nothing else, it would send a message that someone was watching, that the girl wasn't as alone and unprotected as her tormentors might believe. At 3:15, Marcus positioned himself near the spot where yesterday's confrontation had taken place, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid looking like he was lurking or creating a scene. The first students began emerging from the building, and Marcus scanned the crowd for familiar faces, looking for either Isabella or the boys who had been surrounding her yesterday. He spotted the tall boy in the expensive jacket first, walking with the same group of friends and displaying the kind of casual arrogance that suggested he'd faced no consequences for yesterday's behavior. The group was moving with purpose toward the area where the buses were parked, but their trajectory would take them past the spot where Isabella usually waited for her ride. Marcus tensed, preparing to intervene again if necessary, but before he could move, something unexpected happened. A second black sedan, identical to the one that had picked up Isabella yesterday, pulled up to the curb directly in front of the school entrance. This time, two men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle, and Marcus could see that both were wearing earpieces and had the kind of professional bearing that screamed security detail. The boys, who had been walking toward the bus area, suddenly changed direction, veering away from the entrance with the kind of rapid course correction that suggested they'd received an urgent message to avoid the area. Within moments, they had disappeared into the crowd of students, leaving Marcus wondering what kind of influence Isabella's family wielded that could clear a path through a crowd of middle schoolers with nothing more than the appearance of two well-dressed men. Isabella emerged from the building a few minutes later, walking with the same careful composure Marcus had noticed yesterday. She spotted him immediately, her eyes widening with surprise before a small smile crossed her face. She approached him with hesitant steps, glancing around to make sure no one was watching their interaction. "You came back," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that suggested this was more significant to her than Marcus had realized. "I told you I'd make some phone calls," Marcus replied. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Isabella nodded toward the black sedans. "My grandfather sent extra security today. I think someone told him about yesterday." Marcus looked more closely at the men in suits, noting the way they positioned themselves to have clear sightlines in all directions, the subtle bulges under their jackets that suggested they were armed. This wasn't just the cautious protection of wealthy parents. This was the kind of security typically reserved for people who faced genuine threats to their safety. "Isabella," Marcus said carefully, "what exactly does your grandfather do?" For a moment, she looked like she was going to deflect the question with the same careful evasion she'd used yesterday. Then something in her expression shifted, as if she were making a decision about how much truth she could afford to share. "He's in politics," she said simply. "Very high-level politics, the kind where people sometimes try to hurt your family to get to you." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Marcus. Isabella wasn't just wealthy. She was part of a family that operated at the highest levels of power, where personal security was a necessity rather than a luxury, and where a 12-year-old girl's safety required the kind of protection usually reserved for heads of state. The bullying she faced at school wasn't just about typical teenage cruelty. It was potentially connected to her family's political enemies, people who might see a vulnerable child as a pressure point to be exploited. That's why you go to public school instead of some private academy, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. Isabella nodded. Grandfather thinks it's important for me to understand how normal people live, to stay connected to the real world instead of growing up in some bubble of privilege. But it's complicated, because I can't really be normal when there are always security concerns and family obligations that other kids don't have to worry about. Marcus felt a new wave of sympathy for this girl who was caught between two worlds, too privileged to fit in with her working-class classmates, yet too constrained by security concerns and family expectations to enjoy the freedoms that most teenagers took for granted. The bullying she faced was just one symptom of a larger isolation that came from being different in ways that most people couldn't understand or relate to. One of the security guards approached them, moving with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested he'd been briefed on Marcus's role in the previous day's events. "Miss Isabella," the man said, "your grandfather would like to speak with you when you get home. He also asked me to extend an invitation to Mr. Rivera to join you for dinner this evening, if he's available." Marcus blinked in surprise. An invitation to dinner with Isabella's grandfather, a man who apparently operated at the highest levels of politics and required armed security for his family. It was the kind of opportunity that most people could only dream of. A chance to glimpse a world of power and influence that existed far beyond his normal experience, but it was also potentially dangerous, a step into complexities that he wasn't equipped to handle and that could have consequences for both him and Emma that he couldn't predict. Getting more involved with Isabella's family meant accepting responsibilities and risks that went far beyond helping a bullied child, entering into relationships with people whose lives operated according to rules he didn't understand. Isabella looked at him with hopeful eyes, waiting for his response to an invitation that clearly meant more to her than simple social courtesy. For a girl who seemed to have few genuine connections to people outside her family's sphere of influence, his presence represented something valuable and rare, a relationship based on kindness rather than obligation or political calculation. Marcus thought about Emma, about the simple life they'd built together and the careful balance they'd achieved between financial stability and emotional security. Getting involved with Isabella's family could disrupt that balance in ways he couldn't control, bringing attention and complications into their lives that might ultimately do more harm than good. But he also thought about the girl standing in front of him, isolated and vulnerable despite all her family's wealth and power, reaching out to him because he'd shown her a moment of basic human decency in a world that seemed determined to treat her as either a target or a political asset. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. "I'd be honored to have dinner with your grandfather," Marcus said, watching as Isabella's face lit up with genuine joy for the first time since he'd met her. As he followed the black sedan through the increasingly upscale neighborhoods that led away from Jefferson Middle School, Marcus realized that his life had just taken a turn toward possibilities and dangers that he couldn't have imagined when he'd gotten up that morning to install crown molding in a Victorian mansion. Whatever happened next, he was no longer just a construction worker trying to raise his daughter and pay his bills. He was about to become part of a story much larger and more complex than anything he'd ever experienced. The iron gates closed behind them with a soft, mechanical hum that spoke of precision engineering and serious money. Marcus followed the black sedan up a winding driveway that curved through meticulously maintained grounds, past ancient oak trees that had probably been standing when this part of the city was still countryside. The mansion that came into view as they rounded the final curve was unlike anything he'd ever seen outside of movies or magazine spreads, a sprawling colonial revival that managed to be both imposing and elegant. Its white columns and red brick, Facade, speaking of old money and established power. Marcus parked his battered pickup truck next to the sedan, acutely aware of how out of place his vehicle looked in the circular drive. The construction dust on his boots suddenly felt like a personal failing as he walked toward the front entrance, where Isabella was waiting with a man who could only be her grandfather. Even from a distance, Marcus could sense the authority that surrounded the older man like an invisible force field, the kind of presence that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Senator William Montgomery was exactly what Marcus had expected a high-level politician to look like, if he'd been prepared to expect anything at all. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair that was perfectly styled, and clothes that probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. He carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But there was warmth in his eyes when he looked at Isabella, a grandfatherly affection that humanized him in a way that no amount of political posturing could have achieved. "Mr. Rivera," Senator Montgomery said, extending his hand with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his career greeting strangers and making them feel comfortable. "I can't thank you enough for what you did for Isabella yesterday. In our family, we understand the value of people who stand up for what's right, regardless of personal cost." Marcus shook the senator's hand, noting the firm grip and the way the older man looked directly into his eyes, a politician's trick for creating instant connection and trust. "I just did what anyone would have done, Senator. No child should have to deal with that kind of harassment." "Please call me William," the senator said, gesturing toward the front door. "And you'd be surprised how few people actually would have done what you did. It takes a special kind of character to get involved in someone else's problems when you have nothing to gain and everything to lose." They walked into the mansion through a foyer that could have housed Marcus's entire apartment, with marble floors that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than his annual salary. Original oil paintings lined the walls, and Marcus recognized at least 2 that he'd seen in museums, wondering how someone could casually own pieces of art that belonged in public collections. Everything spoke of wealth that had been accumulated over generations, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself because its presence was felt in every carefully chosen detail. Isabella walked beside them, still wearing her school uniform, but somehow transformed by the setting, her careful posture now reading as natural grace rather than defensive caution. This was her world, Marcus realized, the environment where she belonged, and where her precise movements and formal speech patterns made perfect sense. At school, surrounded by kids in jeans and sneakers, she stood out as artificially refined. Here, she simply looked like a young woman being raised to take her place in a family that operated at the highest levels of society. "Isabella tells me you're in construction," Senator Montgomery said as they walked through a hallway lined with family portraits that seemed to chronicle several generations of political and social prominence. "That's honest work, the foundation of everything we build as a society. I started my career in public works, actually, before I moved into politics. There's something to be said for creating things that will outlast us." Marcus appreciated the sentiment, though he suspected the senator's experience with public works had been more administrative than hands-on. Still, there was something genuine in the way he spoke about construction work, a respect that seemed to come from understanding rather than political calculation. It occurred to Marcus that a successful politician would need to be able to connect with people from all walks of life, to find common ground, even when the gaps in experience and privilege were as vast as the Grand Canyon. They entered a sitting room that managed to be both formal and comfortable, with leather furniture that looked like it had been perfectly maintained for decades, and books that showed signs of actual reading rather than decorative arrangement. Senator Montgomery gestured for Marcus to take a seat in a wingback chair that was probably worth more than his truck, while Isabella perched on the edge of a sofa with the kind of perfect posture that suggested years of etiquette training. "Can I offer you something to drink?" the senator asked, moving to a bar cart that contained bottles Marcus didn't recognize, but suspected were prohibitively expensive. "I have an excellent whiskey, or perhaps something non-alcoholic if you prefer." "Water would be fine," Marcus said, feeling suddenly conscious of his work clothes and wondering if he should have asked to clean up before this conversation. But the senator poured 3 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher, serving Marcus first with the kind of attention to protocol that made it clear he took hospitality seriously, regardless of his guests' social status. "Isabella has told me about the situation at school," Senator Montgomery said, settling into his own chair with the careful movements of someone who had learned to project authority even in casual moments. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than typical schoolyard bullying, though I suspect you've already figured that out." Marcus nodded, glancing at Isabella, who was studying her hands with the kind of intensity that suggested she was struggling with how much of her family's business should be shared with a virtual stranger. "She mentioned that you're in politics and that security is a concern for your family." The senator's expression grew more serious. "I chair the Senate Intelligence Committee, which means I deal with matters of national security on a daily basis. It also means that my family lives under constant scrutiny and occasional threat from people who disagree with the decisions we make on behalf of the American people. Isabella's safety isn't just a personal concern. It's a matter that affects our national security infrastructure." The weight of that statement settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. He'd assumed that Isabella came from a wealthy family with some political connections, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous than he'd imagined. Senator Montgomery wasn't just another politician. He was someone who dealt with classified information and life-or-death decisions on a regular basis, which meant that his granddaughter was potentially a target for foreign agents, domestic terrorists, and anyone else who might see her as a way to influence or intimidate one of the most powerful men in Washington. "The boys who were bothering Isabella," Marcus said slowly, "are their families connected to your political opponents?" "In a manner of speaking," the senator replied. "One of the boys is the son of a lobbyist who represents interests that are directly opposed to legislation I've been championing. Another comes from a family that has significant business dealings with countries whose activities we've been investigating. It's possible that the harassment Isabella faces is entirely typical teenage behavior, but it's also possible that it's being encouraged by adults who see an opportunity to send a message." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of what the senator was telling him. Isabella wasn't just being bullied by classmates, she was potentially being targeted as part of a larger political strategy designed to pressure her grandfather. The casual cruelty of middle school social dynamics had been weaponized by adults who were willing to use children as pawns in their political games. "That's why you sent extra security to the school today," Marcus said. Senator Montgomery nodded. "Among other things, we've also been in contact with the school administration, though our options there are limited by the need to maintain Isabella's cover as a normal student. If we respond too aggressively to what appears to be typical bullying, we risk exposing the security concerns that could make her an even bigger target." Isabella spoke for the first time since they'd entered the house, her voice quiet but steady. "Grandfather thinks I should transfer to a private school where security would be easier to manage, but I don't want to run away. I like Jefferson Middle School, and I don't want to let those boys think they've won." Marcus could hear the stubborn pride in her voice, the same quality that had probably kept her from fighting back against her tormentors or seeking help from school administrators. She was a Montgomery, raised in a family where backing down from a fight wasn't an option, even when the fight involved 12-year-old bullies with powerful parents. The problem, Senator Montgomery continued, is that Isabella's safety requires a delicate balance between protection and normalcy. Too much security presence at the school creates problems for other students and staff. Too little leaves her vulnerable to people who may be operating with agendas that go far beyond typical teenage conflict. Marcus began to understand why he'd been invited to dinner. His intervention yesterday had demonstrated both his willingness to protect Isabella and his ability to do so without creating the kind of scene that would attract unwanted attention. He wasn't part of the political world that surrounded the Montgomery family, which meant he could potentially provide help without becoming entangled in the complex web of alliances and enemies that defined their daily existence. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Marcus said, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Nothing beyond what you've already done," the senator replied. "Continue to be aware of Isabella's situation when you're picking up your daughter from school. If you see something that concerns you, intervene in the same way you did yesterday. Think of it as being a good neighbor, someone who looks out for a child who needs protection." It sounded simple when he put it that way, but Marcus understood that accepting this responsibility would mean becoming part of something much larger than a favor for a grateful family. He would be taking on a role in protecting someone whose safety was connected to national security interests, making himself a potential target for people who operated according to rules he didn't understand and couldn't predict. But looking at Isabella, sitting perfectly still on the edge of the sofa with her hands folded in her lap, Marcus found it impossible to say no. She was just a child, caught up in circumstances that were far beyond her control, trying to have some semblance of a normal life despite the extraordinary pressures that surrounded her family. If his presence at the school could provide her with even a small measure of protection and normalcy, then it was a responsibility he couldn't refuse. "I pick up my daughter every day at 3:15, Marcus said. "I can make sure to keep an eye on things." Senator Montgomery smiled, and for the first time since Marcus had met him, the expression seemed entirely genuine rather than political. "Thank you, Mr. Rivera. You have no idea how much that means to Isabella and to our family." Isabella looked up then, her eyes bright with gratitude and something that might have been relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Really, it helps to know that someone is watching out for me who doesn't have to." Marcus felt a strange tightness in his chest at her words, recognizing the loneliness that came through despite her careful composure. Here was a girl who had everything money could buy, but lacked the simple security of knowing that someone cared about her welfare without being paid to do so or obligated by family loyalty. His presence at the school represented something precious. To her, genuine human connection in a world where most relationships were filtered through political calculation and security concerns. "There is one other matter we should discuss," Senator Montgomery said, his tone becoming more formal. "Isabella's safety concerns extend beyond the school environment. We've had intelligence suggesting that there may be more organized attempts to target our family in the coming weeks, related to some high-profile legislation that's moving through committee. I want you to be aware that your association with Isabella could potentially put you and your daughter at risk." The words hit Marcus like a cold splash of water, reminding him that this wasn't just about helping a bullied child, but about entering into a world where danger was a constant presence and where innocent people could become collateral damage in conflicts they didn't understand. He thought about Emma, about their quiet life in Riverside Heights, about the careful balance they'd achieved between security and happiness in the 3 years since Linda's death. "What kind of risk are we talking about?" Marcus asked. "Probably minimal," the senator said, though his tone suggested he was being careful not to overstate the safety of the situation. "Most likely you'd simply be watched, your background investigated, your daily routines monitored. These people prefer to gather information rather than take direct action unless they perceive a significant threat to their interests." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that probably minimal risk from someone in Senator Montgomery's position still represented a level of danger that most people never had to consider. Having his life investigated by unknown parties, having strangers monitor his movements and potentially threaten his daughter's safety, was a price he'd never imagined he might have to pay for a simple act of kindness. But as he looked at Isabella, he realized that walking away now would mean abandoning a child who had already been abandoned by too many adults who should have protected her. The boys who harassed her at school did so because they believed she was alone and vulnerable, that no one would stand up for her who wasn't being paid to do so. Leaving her to face that harassment alone, knowing what he now knew about the political forces that might be driving it, felt like a betrayal of everything he believed about responsibility and basic human decency. "I understand the risks," Marcus said finally. "I'm still willing to help." Senator Montgomery studied him for a long moment, and Marcus had the sense that he was being evaluated according to criteria he couldn't guess at, judged by standards that came from decades of making decisions about whom to trust with matters of life and death importance. "There's something else," the senator said eventually. "I'd like to offer you a job." Marcus blinked in surprise. "A job?" "My Georgetown residence needs some renovation work, updating the security systems and making modifications that would allow us to host political events more safely. I need someone I can trust to oversee the project, someone who understands both construction and discretion. The pay would be significantly better than what you're making now, and it would allow you to have more flexible hours for picking up your daughter from school." The offer was so unexpected that Marcus didn't know how to respond. A job working directly for Senator Montgomery would provide financial security beyond anything he'd ever imagined, the kind of steady, well-paying work that could transform his and Emma's lives. But it would also mean becoming even more deeply involved with a family whose enemies operated according to rules he didn't understand, accepting responsibilities that went far beyond construction work. "I don't know anything about security systems," Marcus said. "You'd be working with specialists who do," the senator replied. "Your role would be to coordinate the construction aspects and ensure that the work is completed to the highest standards. Think of it as project management with some very specific requirements." Isabella leaned forward slightly, her expression hopeful. "It would mean you'd be around more often," she said. "Not just at school pickup, but for family dinners and events. It would be nice to have a friend who understands what normal life is like." Marcus understood that the job offer was about more than his construction skills or his willingness to help protect Isabella at school. The senator was offering him a place in their world, a role that would provide both financial security and the kind of social connections that could open doors for Emma's future that would otherwise remain permanently closed. But accepting would also mean leaving behind the simple life they'd built together, entering into relationships and obligations that could change everything about who they were and how they lived. He thought about Emma, about the conversation they'd had the night before, about her math homework, about his growing inability to help her with the academic challenges that would only become more difficult as she got older. A job with Senator Montgomery would provide not just better pay, but access to resources and opportunities that could give Emma advantages he'd never been able to offer on his own. "I'd need to think about it," Marcus said. "Talk to my daughter, make sure she's comfortable with the changes it would mean for our lives." "Of course," Senator Montgomery said. "Take all the time you need. The offer will remain open, and there's no pressure to accept. I simply wanted you to know that we value what you've done for Isabella, and that we'd like to find ways to express that gratitude in practical terms." They moved to the dining room for dinner, a formal affair with more courses than Marcus had. Seen outside of wedding receptions and service, that made him understand why wealthy people needed full-time staff to manage their households. The conversation ranged from politics to construction to Isabella's school experiences, with the senator demonstrating the kind of easy charm that made Marcus understand how he'd built a successful political career. But underneath the polite dinner conversation, Marcus could sense undercurrents of tension and concern that reminded him constantly that this wasn't just a social evening, but a strategic meeting between people whose lives operated according to very different rules. Isabella was more animated during dinner than Marcus had seen her at school, asking questions about his work and telling stories about her teachers that revealed a sharp wit and observational skills that her careful public demeanor usually kept hidden. She was still clearly a child, despite her formal upbringing, and Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying her company in a way that reminded him of the conversations he had with Emma when she was excited about something that had happened during her day. After dinner, Senator Montgomery walked Marcus to his truck, the two men moving through the evening air that carried the scent of expensive landscaping and old money security. The senator's security detail maintained a discreet presence around the property, visible enough to remind Marcus that this was a home where danger was always a consideration, but professional enough to avoid making him feel like he was under surveillance. "I want you to know," the senator said as they reached Marcus's truck, "that I've had you investigated since yesterday evening. I hope you'll forgive the invasion of privacy, but Isabella's safety requires that we know everything about the people who come into contact with her." Marcus nodded, having expected as much. "What did you find out?" "That you're exactly who you appear to be," the senator replied. "A good man who's worked hard to provide for his daughter despite facing challenges that would have broken lesser people. Your wife's accident, the financial struggles that followed, the way you've managed to keep your family together and your daughter on the right path. All of it speaks to the kind of character that we need more of in this world." The words carried weight because they came from someone who had access to information that most people couldn't obtain, who had probably read reports about Marcus's life that contained details he'd forgotten himself. It was simultaneously flattering and unsettling to know that his entire existence had been reduced to a file that summarized his worthiness to associate with the Montgomery family. Isabella doesn't have many people in her life who see her as simply a child rather than a political asset or a security concern, the senator continued. "Your friendship means more to her than you probably realize, and it would mean everything to our family if you'd consider becoming a more permanent part of our lives." Marcus understood that this was more than a job offer or a request for security assistance. The senator was inviting him to join a family whose bonds were forged by shared danger and mutual dependence, to become part of a community where loyalty was both demanded and rewarded in ways that most people couldn't imagine. It was an extraordinary opportunity, but it was also a transformation that would change everything about his and Emma's lives in ways he couldn't predict or control. "I'll talk to Emma tonight," Marcus said. "Give you an answer tomorrow." "That's all I can ask," the senator replied, shaking Marcus's hand with the same firm grip he'd used when they first met. Whatever you decide, know that you've already done more for our family than we had any right to expect from a stranger." As Marcus drove home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, he found himself thinking about the conversation he would need to have with Emma about how to explain to a 13-year-old girl that their lives might be about to change in ways that seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. The job offer represented financial security and opportunities that could transform Emma's future, but it also meant accepting risks and responsibilities that could endanger the simple happiness they'd worked so hard to achieve. The contrast between the Montgomery mansion and his modest apartment had never been more apparent than when Marcus climbed the creaking stairs to his third-floor home, where Emma was waiting with homework spread across the kitchen table and questions about his extended absence that he wasn't sure how to answer. How did you explain to a child that you'd been offered a chance to join one of the most powerful families in the country, but that accepting might mean giving up the uncomplicated life that had been their anchor through the worst period of their lives? Emma looked up from her math homework as he entered, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern as she took in his serious demeanor. "Dad, is everything okay? You look like someone died." Marcus sat down across from her at the kitchen table, studying his daughter's face and trying to imagine how she would react to the news that their lives might be about to become extraordinary in ways that could be either wonderful or terrifying. Emma was resilient, had proven that over and over again in the 3 years since her mother's death, but she was also still a child who deserved stability and predictability in a world that had already taken too much from her. "I need to tell you about something that happened today," Marcus said carefully. "Something that might change things for us in some pretty big ways." Emma set down her pencil and gave him her full attention, her expression becoming serious in the way that reminded Marcus of how much she'd grown up since Linda's death, how she'd learned to recognize when adult conversations required her mature consideration rather than childish reaction. "The girl I helped yesterday, Isabella, her family is more important than I realized," Marcus began. "Her grandfather is a senator, someone who makes decisions about national security and deals with some very powerful and dangerous people. He's offered me a job working on his house, something that would pay a lot more money than what I make now and give us opportunities we've never had before." Emma listened intently as Marcus explained the situation, her questions revealing the sharp intelligence that sometimes surprised him with its sophistication. She wanted to know about the risks, about how their daily lives would change, about whether accepting the job would mean giving up the independence that had been so important to their recovery from Linda's death. "Would we have to move?" Emma asked. "Not necessarily, though we could afford a better place if we wanted one," Marcus replied. "Would I have to change schools? No, you could stay at Jefferson if you wanted to." Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the information with the kind of careful consideration that reminded Marcus of her mother's approach to major decisions. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 13 years. "This is about more than just a job, isn't it?" she said. "This is about whether we want our lives to be different than they've always been." Marcus nodded, impressed once again by his daughter's ability to cut through complexity to reach the heart of an issue. "Yeah, it is. If I take this job, we become part of something much bigger than what we've known. We'd have more money, more opportunities, but we'd also have more responsibilities and maybe more risks." Emma considered this for another long moment, then asked the question that Marcus had been dreading. "What do you want to do, Dad?" It was the question he'd been asking himself since leaving the Montgomery mansion, and he still wasn't sure he had a clear answer. The practical benefits of accepting the senator's offer were obvious and overwhelming, but there was also something to be said for the simple life they'd built together, for the independence and authenticity that came with earning their way through hard work and modest ambitions, but as he looked at Emma sitting at their second-hand kitchen table with homework that he was increasingly unable to help her with, Marcus realized that his decision couldn't be based on his own comfort or preferences. He was a father first, and that meant making choices based on what would give his daughter the best possible future, even if those choices required sacrifices and risks that made him uncomfortable. "I think we should say yes," Marcus said finally. "I think this is the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime, and we'd regret it forever if we let fear keep us from taking advantage of it." Emma smiled then, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since he'd started explaining the situation. "I think so too," she said. "Besides, it sounds like Isabella really needs a friend, and I know how that feels." Marcus felt a surge of pride in his daughter's maturity and compassion, recognizing that she understood the situation not just in terms of what it could do for their family, but in terms of what they could do for someone else who needed help. Emma had inherited her mother's generous spirit, the quality that made her think about other people's needs even when making decisions that would affect her own life. "There's one more thing," Marcus said. "If I take this job, our lives are going to become a lot more complicated. There will be security concerns, background checks, people watching us to make sure we don't pose any risks to the senator or his family. Are you okay with that level of scrutiny?" Emma shrugged, with the kind of adolescent confidence that made everything seem manageable. "If it means we can help Isabella and have a better life, I think it's worth it. Besides, it's not like we have any deep, dark secrets they're going to discover." Marcus laughed, feeling some of the tension that had been building in his chest since the dinner conversation began to dissolve. Emma was right. They were exactly who they appeared to be, people whose lives would withstand any amount of investigation because they'd always lived according to principles of honesty and integrity that left nothing to hide. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus called Senator Montgomery to accept the job offer. The conversation was brief and professional, with details about start dates and salary negotiations left for future discussions. But there was warmth in the senator's voice that suggested genuine pleasure at Marcus's decision, the kind of satisfaction that came from adding someone trustworthy to a world where trust was both essential and rare. As Marcus lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the extraordinary turn his life had taken in just 2 days, he found himself remembering Linda and wondering what she would have thought about the opportunities that were opening up for him and Emma. She had always believed that good things happened to people who were willing to take risks for the right reasons, who put compassion ahead of caution when faced with chances to help others. The job with Senator Montgomery was certainly a risk, but it was also a chance to provide Emma with advantages that would transform her future while helping a child who desperately needed protection and friendship. Linda would have understood. The decision, Marcus realized, would have supported it even if it meant leaving behind the familiar safety of their modest life for the unknown challenges that came with joining one of the most powerful families in the country. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. Marcus woke before his alarm with the excited energy that came from knowing his life was about to change in fundamental ways. That the routine he'd followed for 3 years was about to be replaced by something entirely new and potentially extraordinary. Over breakfast, Emma peppered him with questions about what his new job would involve, what Senator Montgomery's house was like, whether Isabella would become a regular part of their lives. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Marcus of why taking risks could be worth the potential rewards when those risks were taken for the right reasons. At the construction site, Marcus had the difficult conversation with Miguel Rivera about leaving his job, explaining as much as he could about the new opportunity without revealing details that weren't his to share. Miguel was disappointed but understanding, recognizing that the kind of advancement Marcus was being offered didn't come along often for people in their line of work. "You're a good man, Marcus," Miguel said, as they shook hands for what would be the last time as employer and employee. "Whatever this new job involves, they're lucky to have you." The crew threw together an impromptu farewell lunch with the kind of good-natured ribbing that came from men who had worked together through difficult projects and challenging weather. There was genuine affection in their teasing about Marcus moving up in the world, recognition that his promotion represented a success for all of them, in some small way. That afternoon, Marcus arrived at Jefferson Middle School for pickup time, with a new sense of purpose and responsibility. He was no longer just a parent waiting for his daughter. He was someone who had accepted a role in protecting a child whose safety was connected to matters of national importance. The weight of that responsibility was both intimidating and energizing, a reminder that sometimes ordinary people were called upon to be part of extraordinary circumstances. Isabella spotted him immediately as she emerged from the building, her face lighting up with the kind of genuine happiness that suggested his decision to accept her grandfather's offer had already begun to transform her daily experience. She walked toward him with more confidence than he'd seen from her before, as if knowing that someone was watching out for her had given her permission to hold her head a little higher. "Mr. Rivera," she said as she approached, "Grandfather told me about your decision. Thank you." Marcus smiled, recognizing that this simple expression of gratitude represented the beginning of a relationship that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet predict. "Thank you for trusting me with something so important, Isabella." As they stood there in the afternoon sunshine, waiting for Emma to appear and for Isabella's security detail to arrive, Marcus felt the satisfaction that came from making a decision that was both practically beneficial and morally right. He was about to become part of something much larger than himself, to take on responsibilities that would test his courage and integrity in ways he'd never imagined. But looking at Isabella's happy face and thinking about the opportunities that lay ahead for Emma, Marcus knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes the most important decisions in life came disguised as simple acts of kindness, and sometimes those acts of kindness opened doors to possibilities that could transform everything about who you were and what you could become. The luxury cars that would soon surround his house were still in his future, but already Marcus could feel his life shifting towards something extraordinary. Something that would test everything he believed about himself while offering rewards he'd never dared to imagine. The quiet construction worker who had stopped to help a bullied child was about to discover just how far a single act of courage could take him when it caught the attention of people who operated at the highest levels of power and influence. Emma appeared then, walking with her usual confident stride and scanning the area until she spotted her father talking with a girl she recognized from school. The smile that crossed her face suggested she understood immediately that this was Isabella, the girl whose problems had somehow become entangled with their family's future in ways that promised adventure and opportunity beyond anything their previous life had offered. As the three of them stood together in the afternoon sunshine, Marcus realized that this was the moment when their old life officially ended and their new one began. When a simple decision to help a stranger in need had evolved into something that would change everything about who they were and what their future would hold. The luxury cars were coming, along with all the opportunities and dangers they represented. And Marcus Rivera was as ready as anyone could be for a transformation he still didn't fully understand, but had committed to embrace with all the courage and integrity he could muster. The transformation began subtly, like morning fog, rolling in so gradually that you don't notice the world changing, until suddenly you can't see familiar landmarks anymore. Marcus's first week working at Senator Montgomery's Georgetown residence started with what seemed like routine renovation meetings, discussions about crown molding, and security system placement that felt comfortably within his expertise. But by Friday, he was sitting in on briefings about threat assessments and evacuation protocols, listening to conversations that made it clear his new job involved responsibilities far beyond anything he'd encountered in residential construction. The Georgetown house itself was a study in understated power, a federal-style mansion that had been home to influential families since the 19th century. Unlike the imposing colonial where he'd had dinner with the senator, this residence was designed for conducting business, with formal reception rooms that could accommodate diplomatic meetings and private spaces where classified conversations could take place without electronic surveillance. Marcus found himself learning a vocabulary of security terms he'd never needed before, understanding the difference between hard rooms and soft rooms, between passive and active countermeasures, between threats that were theoretical and threats that required immediate tactical response. Dr. Sarah Chen, the security consultant who was overseeing the technical aspects of the renovation, had the kind of credentials that made Marcus wonder why someone with her background was willing to work on a residential project. Former NSA, with advanced degrees in both electrical engineering and international relations, she spoke about surveillance detection and electronic countermeasures with the casual expertise that Marcus brought to discussions of load-bearing walls and electrical capacity. Her presence on the project made it clear that this wasn't ordinary home improvement, but something that bordered on creating a secure facility that happened to look like a private residence. The challenge, Dr. Chen explained during their third planning meeting, is maintaining the historical integrity of the building while installing systems that can detect and counter sophisticated surveillance attempts. We're not just worried about photographers with telephoto lenses anymore. We're dealing with directed energy weapons, acoustic monitoring, and electronic intrusion that can turn a cell phone into a listening device from 3 blocks away. Marcus found himself taking notes in a composition book that he kept locked, in a safe Dr. Chen had installed in his temporary office, writing down technical specifications and security protocols that he was beginning to understand were classified information. The weight of that responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying, a reminder that his decision to accept Senator Montgomery's job offer had moved him into a world where casual conversations could have implications for national security. Isabella had become a regular presence at the Georgetown house, arriving each afternoon with a security detail that Marcus was learning to recognize by their subtle positioning and communication patterns. She would complete her homework in the senator's private study, while Marcus coordinated with contractors and specialists, occasionally emerging to ask questions about the renovation work that revealed her sharp curiosity about how things were built and how they could be made secure. "Why do you need to replace all the windows if they're already bulletproof?" she asked one afternoon, peering over his shoulder as he reviewed blueprints that showed the installation of what Dr. Chen called acoustic isolation systems. "The new ones are better at blocking electronic signals," Marcus explained, having learned enough about the technical aspects to give a basic explanation. "Someone could potentially use high-frequency transmissions to listen to conversations through regular bulletproof glass, but these new windows prevent that kind of intrusion." Isabella nodded with the kind of serious attention that reminded Marcus she'd grown up understanding that her family's privacy and security were matters of life and death rather than simple preference. At 12 years old, she already knew more about threat assessment and protective protocols than most adults would learn in a lifetime, knowledge that should have been unnecessary for a child, but was essential for someone in her position. The first indication that Marcus's association with the Montgomery family was attracting unwanted attention came on a Thursday evening when he arrived home to find Emma waiting in the lobby of their apartment building instead of upstairs doing homework as usual. Her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of studied calm that meant she was working hard not to show how worried she was about something. "There were some men here earlier," she said without preamble as they climbed the stairs to their third-floor apartment. "They asked Mrs. Peterson about our family, wanted to know about your work schedule and whether we had visitors. She didn't tell them anything, but she thought you should know." Mrs. Peterson was their elderly neighbor, a retired teacher who had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of the building's security and who missed nothing that happened in the hallways or parking area. If she was concerned enough to warn Emma about strangers asking questions, it meant the inquiry had been both persistent and inappropriate in ways that had triggered her protective instincts. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he realized that Senator Montgomery's warning about potential surveillance was no longer theoretical. Someone was interested enough in his background to send people to his apartment building to ask questions about his daily routine and family circumstances. The investigation was probably benign. Background research conducted by people who wanted to understand the senator's new associate, but it could also represent something more dangerous, the kind of probing that preceded more aggressive attempts to gather information or apply pressure. "Did you recognize any of them?" Marcus asked as they reached their apartment door. Emma shook her head. Mrs. Peterson said they looked like government types, wearing suits and asking questions in a way that suggested they were used to getting answers. She told them that she minded her own business and expected her neighbors to do the same, but she could tell they weren't satisfied with that response. Marcus made a mental note to thank Mrs. Peterson for her discretion, while also recognizing that his family's safety might require more active protection than relying on the watchful eyes of concerned neighbors. The simple life they'd built in Riverside Heights was becoming complicated by forces beyond their control, obligations and risks that came with his new position in the Montgomery family's sphere of influence. That night, Marcus called the secure number Dr. Chen had given him for reporting security concerns, explaining the afternoon's events and asking for guidance about how to respond to what might be routine background investigation or might represent something more threatening. Her response was both reassuring and concerning, confirming that such inquiries were normal when someone new joined the senator's inner circle, while also making it clear that monitoring would be increased around Marcus's family until the source and intent of the investigation could be determined. "The good news," Dr. Chen said, "is that if someone wanted to harm you or your daughter, they wouldn't announce their presence by asking neighbors about your routine. This sounds like intelligence gathering rather than operational planning, which suggests you're being evaluated rather than targeted." Marcus found limited comfort in the distinction, understanding that being evaluated by unknown parties was still a significant intrusion into their privacy and a reminder that their lives were no longer entirely their own. Emma seemed to take the situation in stride, displaying the kind of resilient adaptability that had carried her through her mother's death and the financial struggles that followed. But Marcus worried about the long-term impact of living under surveillance and the way it might change her fundamental sense of safety and trust in the world. The following Monday brought a new level of complexity to Marcus's work, when Senator Montgomery informed him that the Georgetown residents would be hosting a private dinner for intelligence officials from allied nations, a meeting that would require the highest levels of security and discretion. The renovation work would need to be completed ahead of schedule, and Marcus would be responsible for coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure that the building's security systems were fully operational and tested before the event. "This dinner," the senator explained during a briefing that took place in what Dr. Chen called a fully secure environment, "will involve discussions about threats to democratic institutions worldwide. The people attending represent some of the most targeted individuals in the intelligence community. which means that any security failure could have consequences that extend far beyond embarrassment or political damage. Marcus found himself studying guest lists and security protocols that carried classification levels he was still learning to understand. Working with specialists whose backgrounds included presidential protection details and counterterrorism operations. The renovation project had evolved into something that resembled military planning, with contingency scenarios for everything from electronic jamming to physical assault, with backup systems for the backup systems and protocols that assumed the worst-case scenario was always possible. Isabella's presence at the house during this period provided an interesting counterpoint to the intense security preparations, her casual questions about the work serving as a reminder that all the sophisticated planning was ultimately about protecting people rather than abstract concepts of national security. She had developed a friendship with Emma that transcended their different backgrounds, the two girls bonding over shared experiences of growing up without mothers and navigating social environments that were complicated by factors beyond their control. "Do you think your dad likes working for grandfather?" Isabella asked Emma one afternoon while the girls worked on homework in the renovated library, surrounded by first edition books and surveillance equipment that had been disguised as decorative elements. Emma considered the question with the kind of thoughtful attention she brought to problems that mattered to her. "I think he likes feeling important," she said finally. "He's always been good at what he does, but now he's doing it for people who really appreciate his skills. And he likes protecting people, especially when those people are kids who need help." Marcus, who was reviewing security camera placement in the adjacent room, felt a surge of pride in his daughter's perceptiveness and her ability to understand the complex motivations that had led him to accept this position. Emma recognized that his work with the Montgomery family satisfied needs that went beyond financial security, fulfilling a desire to be part of something meaningful and important in ways that ordinary construction work had never provided. The dinner party preparations reached their peak intensity in the final week before the event, with Marcus working 18-hour days to coordinate the installation of temporary security measures that would be removed immediately after the guests departed. The house filled with specialists who spoke in codes and acronyms, technicians who tested equipment that Marcus wasn't cleared to understand, and security personnel who moved through the building with the kind of professional alertness that made it clear they were prepared for threats that most people couldn't imagine. Dr. Chen had become something of a mentor to Marcus during this period, helping him understand the broader context of security work and the way that seemingly minor details could have major implications for the safety of high-value targets. Her background in both technical systems and international affairs gave her a unique perspective on the threats facing people like Senator Montgomery, and she seemed to enjoy having someone to educate who brought practical construction knowledge to complex security challenges. "The thing you have to understand," she explained one evening as they reviewed the final security protocols, "is that protecting someone like the senator isn't just about preventing assassination attempts or kidnapping. It's about creating an environment where he can do his job without constantly worrying about surveillance or electronic intrusion, where he can have conversations that shape national policy without wondering who might be listening." Marcus was beginning to appreciate the subtle ways that security concerns influenced every aspect of the senator's life. From the routes he took to work, to the restaurants where he could safely eat dinner, from the friends he could trust with casual conversation, to the family members who required protection simply by virtue of their relationship to him. The dinner party would represent the culmination of months of planning and preparation, a single evening where some of the most important intelligence officials in the world could meet in an environment secure enough to allow completely frank discussion of threats and strategies that could determine the future of democratic institutions worldwide. The evening of the dinner party arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Washington beautiful and reminded Marcus of why he'd fallen in love with the city during his brief stint in community college before life circumstances had forced him to focus on more immediate concerns of earning a living and supporting a family. The Georgetown house had been transformed into something that resembled a diplomatic facility, with security perimeters that extended for several blocks and coordination between multiple agencies that turned the quiet residential street into a carefully controlled environment where every person and vehicle had been screened and approved. Marcus's role during the event was to remain on call in case any technical problems arose with the security systems, monitoring communications and ready to coordinate with repair specialists if any equipment malfunctioned. It was both thrilling and anticlimactic. Hours of careful attention to status indicators and communication protocols that confirmed that all the preparation had been successful in creating an environment where nothing dramatic needed to happen. But the real drama came the following morning when Dr. Chen informed Marcus that electronic surveillance equipment had been detected in buildings surrounding the Georgetown house, sophisticated monitoring systems that had been installed recently and were clearly designed to intercept communications from the senator's residence. The equipment was too advanced to represent casual curiosity or opportunistic intelligence gathering. It suggested a coordinated effort by someone with significant resources and technical capabilities. "We're dealing with a professional operation," Dr. Chen explained during an emergency briefing that included Marcus, Senator Montgomery, and representatives from multiple intelligence agencies. The surveillance equipment is commercial grade, but modified in ways that suggest state-level resources. Someone invested serious money and planning in trying to monitor last night's dinner. Marcus felt a chill as he realized that the quiet renovation work he'd been coordinating was actually part of an ongoing intelligence battle, that the Georgetown house was a target for sophisticated adversaries who viewed Senator Montgomery's work as a threat to their interests. The dinner party had been more than a social event. It had been a test of security systems and protocols, a real-world exercise that had revealed both the effectiveness of their preparations and the seriousness of the threats they faced. The discovery of the surveillance equipment also made it clear that Marcus's family was now at the center of a conflict that extended far beyond schoolyard bullying or political disagreements. If foreign intelligence services were willing to invest in monitoring the senator's residence, they would certainly be interested in the people who had access to that residence, the contractors and employees who might provide pathways for gathering information or applying pressure. "We need to implement enhanced protection for all family members and close associates," the intelligence representative explained, his tone suggesting that this was a routine escalation rather than a cause for panic. "Mr. Rivera, that includes you and your daughter. We'll be providing security details and monitoring your residence until we can determine the scope of the threat and neutralize the surveillance operation." Marcus found himself nodding agreement to protective measures he didn't fully understand, accepting that his and Emma's lives would now include the kind of security oversight that he'd previously associated with witness protection programs or presidential families. The simple decision to help a bullied child had evolved into circumstances that required armed protection and electronic countermeasures, obligations and risks that transformed them from ordinary citizens into potential targets for people who operated according to rules he was only beginning to comprehend. That afternoon, as Marcus drove to pick up Emma from school with a security detail following at a discreet distance, he found himself thinking about the conversation they would need to have about the changes that were about to affect their daily lives. How did you explain to a 13-year-old that their home would now be monitored by federal agents, that their phone calls might be intercepted by foreign intelligence services, that the simple act of going to school or meeting friends would require security considerations that most people never had to think about. Emma was waiting by the school entrance when Marcus arrived, her expression suggesting that she'd already noticed the additional cars in the pickup area and the men in suits who were positioned with the kind of professional alertness that marked them as security personnel rather than ordinary parents. Her sharp observational skills, inherited from her mother and honed by 3 years of helping manage their household finances and responsibilities, had clearly identified the changes in their situation before Marcus had a chance to explain them. "So it's gotten more serious," she said as she climbed into the truck, her tone matter-of-fact rather than worried. "The men who were asking questions about us last week, they weren't just curious." Marcus nodded, impressed once again by his daughter's ability to read complex situations and adapt to changing circumstances without losing her essential optimism and resilience. "Yeah, it's gotten more serious. There are going to be some people keeping an eye on us for a while, making sure we're safe while they figure out exactly what kind of threats we might be facing." Emma considered this information with the kind of practical assessment that reminded Marcus of her mother's approach to problems that couldn't be solved immediately but had to be managed carefully over time. "Does this mean we can't have normal lives anymore?" It was the question Marcus had been dreading, partly because he wasn't sure he knew the answer, and partly because he suspected that their definition of normal life was about to change in ways that might be permanent. The security measures being implemented weren't temporary inconveniences. They were acknowledgments that his family had become part of a world where safety required constant vigilance, and where privacy was a luxury that might no longer be available to them. "It means our lives are going to be different for a while," Marcus said carefully. "Maybe more different than we expected when I first took this job. But it also means we're part of something important, something that matters in ways that go beyond just paying bills and getting by from day to day." Emma nodded slowly, processing the implications of their new circumstances with the kind of mature consideration that made Marcus both proud of her adaptability and sad that she'd had to develop such resilience at such a young age. "As long as we're still us," she said finally, "I think I can handle different." That evening, as Marcus and Emma sat in their apartment with federal agents positioned in the building and electronic monitoring equipment ensuring their communications couldn't be intercepted, Marcus found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. Less than 2 weeks ago, his biggest worry had been whether he could afford to get his truck's brakes checked, and whether he'd be able to help Emma with her increasingly challenging homework assignments. Now he was coordinating security preparations for international intelligence meetings and accepting protective services that placed him and his daughter at the center of conflicts between world powers. The transformation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in movies, rather than real life, but it was also undeniably real and increasingly complex. Isabella's friendship with Emma had deepened into something that resembled sisterhood, providing both girls with companionship that transcended their very different backgrounds and circumstances. Marcus's work with Senator Montgomery had evolved from simple construction management into something that felt like a calling, a chance to use his skills in service of protecting people and institutions that he was beginning to understand were essential to the survival of democratic values worldwide. But the security concerns were also escalating in ways that made it clear their involvement with the Montgomery family carried risks that went far beyond anything Marcus had anticipated when he'd first agreed to help protect Isabella from schoolyard bullies. The sophisticated surveillance operation targeting the Georgetown house suggested that foreign intelligence services viewed Senator Montgomery's work as a significant threat to their interests, and that they were willing to invest substantial resources in monitoring and potentially disrupting his activities. Dr. Chen had briefed Marcus on some of the broader implications of the intelligence battle they'd stumbled into, explaining that Senator Montgomery's committee work involved oversight of programs that directly threatened the operational capabilities of hostile nations. The legislation he was championing would significantly enhance the United States' ability to detect and counter foreign intelligence operations, making it more difficult for adversaries to steal technology, recruit agents, and influence political processes in democratic countries. What you have to understand, Dr. Chen had explained, is that from their perspective, stopping Senator Montgomery's legislative agenda is a matter of operational survival. If his bills become law, it will cost them billions of dollars in intelligence capabilities and years of progress in their efforts to undermine democratic institutions. They view him as an existential threat, which means they're willing to use any means necessary to neutralize his effectiveness. Marcus was beginning to appreciate that his family's safety was connected to geopolitical conflicts that spanned continents and involved resources he could barely comprehend. The surveillance equipment discovered around the Georgetown house represented just one small part of a much larger intelligence operation that probably included attempts to infiltrate Senator Montgomery's staff, monitor his communications, and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited to influence or discredit his work. The protective measures being implemented for Marcus and Emma were designed to prevent them from becoming such vulnerabilities, ensuring that their relationship with the senator couldn't be used as a pressure point by people who understood that attacking family members was often more effective than direct confrontation with protected targets. But those measures also represented an acknowledgement that their lives had become permanently entangled with conflicts they didn't fully understand and couldn't control. As Marcus tucked Emma into bed that night, surrounded by the subtle presence of federal agents and electronic monitoring systems that were supposed to make them safer, but also served as constant reminders of the dangers they faced, he found himself thinking about Linda and wondering what she would have made of their extraordinary circumstances. She had always believed that taking risks for the right reasons was worth the potential consequences, that some opportunities were so important that they justified accepting dangers that more cautious people would avoid. The job with Senator Montgomery was certainly such an opportunity, providing financial security and social connections that could transform Emma's future, while also giving Marcus a chance to be part of something that mattered in ways that went far beyond personal advancement. But it was also a risk that had already changed their lives in ways he couldn't have predicted, and that promised to continue creating challenges and complications for which his experience as a construction worker had left him completely unprepared. Still, as he listened to Emma's steady breathing and watched the subtle movements of shadows that indicated the security personnel who were ensuring their safety, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction with the choice he'd made. They were no longer just survivors, getting by from day to day and hoping that nothing would disrupt the careful balance they'd achieved. They were participants in something larger and more important, contributors to efforts that could determine the future of democratic institutions and the safety of people around the world. The luxury cars that had begun appearing around their apartment building were symbols of how much their lives had changed, but they were also promises of opportunities and adventures that neither he nor Emma could have imagined just weeks ago. The simple act of defending a bullied child had opened doors to a world of power and influence that most people never glimpsed, and while that world carried risks and responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming, it also offered the chance to make a difference in ways that would matter long after the immediate dangers had passed. As Marcus finally fell asleep, surrounded by the sophisticated security apparatus that now defined their daily existence, he felt the kind of peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, regardless of the complications and challenges that lay ahead. The transformation of his and Emma's lives was far from complete, but it was already clear that they had crossed a threshold into something extraordinary, something that would test their courage and integrity while offering rewards they were only beginning to understand. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Marcus received an encrypted message that made his blood run cold. Isabella had been taken from her private car during the morning commute to school, her security detail neutralized with professional precision that suggested military-level planning. The message was simple and direct. Senator Montgomery will withdraw the Intelligence Reform Act within 24 hours, or his granddaughter will disappear permanently. No negotiations, no exceptions, no second chances. Dr. Chen's emergency response team mobilized within minutes, transforming the Georgetown house into a command center that coordinated with intelligence agencies across 3 continents. Marcus found himself at the center of operations, not because of his security expertise, which remained limited, but because Isabella trusted him in ways that might prove crucial if communication with her captors became necessary. The calm, methodical world of construction project management had prepared him for crisis coordination better than anyone had expected. Senator Montgomery's reaction was controlled fury, the kind of cold anger that came from a lifetime of making impossible decisions under extreme pressure. "They've made a fundamental miscalculation," he told the assembled team of agents and analysts. "They assume that threatening Isabella will paralyze my judgment, but they don't understand that protecting her requires stopping people who would use children as weapons. Withdrawing the legislation would only encourage more attacks, more kidnappings, more innocent victims." Emma's response to the crisis surprised everyone, including Marcus. Instead of fear or confusion, she displayed the kind of analytical thinking that reminded him of Linda's ability to find solutions when everyone else was paralyzed by the magnitude of a problem. "Isabella knows things about the people who took her," Emma said during one of the strategy sessions. "She's been studying her security protocols for years, watching how the protection works and learning to identify threats. If anyone can survive this situation and help rescue herself, it's her." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Isabella had managed to activate a hidden emergency transmitter that Dr. Chen had embedded in her school identification badge, a backup system that even her regular security detail hadn't known about. The signal was weak and intermittent, but it provided enough location data for the rescue teams to narrow their search to a warehouse district outside the city where several abandoned buildings offered the kind of isolation that professional kidnappers required. Marcus insisted on joining the rescue operation despite his lack of tactical training, arguing that Isabella would need to see a familiar face when the ordeal ended and that his presence might be crucial for maintaining her psychological stability during what would inevitably be a traumatic experience. Dr. Chen reluctantly agreed, equipping him with body armor and communication equipment while making it clear that his role would be limited to providing support after the tactical phase was completed. The warehouse where Isabella was being held had been chosen for its remote location and defensible positions, but her captors had underestimated both the resources that Senator Montgomery could deploy and the sophisticated tracking technology that Dr. Chen had developed for exactly this kind of situation. The rescue operation unfolded with the precision of a military exercise, neutralizing the kidnappers before they realized they'd been located and securing Isabella within minutes of the initial breach. Marcus would never forget the moment when he saw Isabella emerge from the warehouse, physically unharmed but emotionally shattered by an experience that had tested her courage and resilience in ways no 12-year-old should ever have to endure. She ran to him with the desperate relief of someone who had maintained hope through the darkest hours by focusing on the people who cared about her safety, and Marcus felt the profound responsibility of being trusted with such precious faith in human goodness. The aftermath of the kidnapping brought changes that transformed not just the Montgomery family's security arrangements, but Marcus's role within their organization. Senator Montgomery offered him a permanent position as Director of Personal Security, a role that would involve coordinating protection for the entire family, while overseeing the residential security systems that had proven so crucial during the crisis. The salary was more than Marcus had ever imagined earning, but more importantly, the position represented recognition that his combination of practical skills and personal integrity made him uniquely valuable in a world where trust was both essential and rare. Emma's reaction to their new circumstances reflected the maturity she'd developed through years of adapting to unexpected challenges. "It's like we've become part of a family that happens to be really important," she told Marcus as they discussed the changes that accepting the new position would bring to their lives. "Isabella needs people who care about her for who she is rather than what her family represents, and you need work that makes you feel like you're protecting something that matters." The decision to accept Senator Montgomery's offer meant leaving behind the last vestiges of their old life, moving from their modest apartment to a secure residence within the Georgetown compound where Emma and Isabella could grow up together as something resembling sisters. It meant accepting that their lives would always include security considerations and threat assessments, that simple activities like shopping or attending school events would require planning and coordination that most families never had to consider. But it also meant being part of something larger than themselves, contributing to efforts that protected democratic institutions and defended the values that made their extraordinary opportunities possible. Marcus's work coordinating security systems and emergency protocols had evolved into something that felt like a calling, a chance to use his skills in service of protecting people whose work shaped the future of freedom and justice around the world. Isabella's recovery from the kidnapping was aided by her friendship with Emma, whose steady presence and practical wisdom provided the kind of support that professional counselors couldn't offer. The two girls had developed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds, united by shared experiences of loss and resilience that had taught them both the value of family connections that weren't based on blood relationships, but on chosen loyalty and mutual protection. 6 months after the kidnapping, Marcus stood in the renovated Georgetown house, watching Isabella and Emma work together on a science project that would have been impossible for either girl to complete alone. Isabella's academic brilliance, combined with Emma's practical problem-solving skills, created a partnership that produced results neither could have achieved independently. A reminder that their merged families had created opportunities for both. Girls that extended far beyond simple security and financial advantages. Senator Montgomery had successfully passed the Intelligence Reform Act despite the attempts to derail it through violence and intimidation, legislation that would significantly enhance the nation's ability to detect and counter foreign interference in democratic processes. The kidnapping had actually strengthened support for the bill by demonstrating the lengths to which hostile nations would go to prevent reforms that threatened their intelligence operations. Dr. Chen had been promoted to a position within the Department of Homeland Security, where her expertise in residential security systems was being applied to protecting other high-value targets. But she maintained her connection to the Montgomery family as a consultant and friend who understood the unique challenges of maintaining normal lives while serving as targets for sophisticated adversaries. Marcus's transformation from struggling single father to trusted security director had given him not just financial stability, but a sense of purpose that made every day feel meaningful in ways his previous work had never provided. The simple act of defending a bullied child had opened doors to opportunities he'd never imagined, but more importantly, it had connected him with people whose friendship and trust made the risks and responsibilities worthwhile. Emma's academic performance had improved dramatically since gaining access to the educational resources that came with the Montgomery family's wealth and connections, but her fundamental character remained unchanged. She was still the compassionate, practical girl who had supported Marcus through the worst period of their lives, now enhanced by opportunities to develop her potential in ways that promised a future limited only by her imagination and ambition. Isabella had grown stronger through surviving the kidnapping, developing a confidence and resilience that allowed her to face the challenges of growing up in a high-profile family with grace and determination. Her friendship with Emma provided the foundation of normalcy that Senator Montgomery had always wanted her to have, proof that wealth and power didn't have to create isolation when they were balanced by genuine human connections. As Marcus watched the two girls collaborate on their science project, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought his family to this point. The luxury cars that now surrounded their lives were symbols of security and opportunity rather than intimidation, evidence of how much their circumstances had changed since he'd first spotted Isabella being harassed by schoolyard bullies. The simple decision to help a child in need had evolved into a transformation that affected every aspect of their existence, creating a new family structure that combined the Montgomery's resources and influence with the Rivera's values and resilience. It was proof that sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary choices, that acts of kindness could create ripple effects that changed the world in ways both small and profound. Marcus had learned that protecting democracy wasn't just about grand gestures or political speeches, but about daily acts of courage and integrity that created the foundation for justice and freedom. His work securing the Georgetown house was part of a larger effort to ensure that good people could continue making decisions that protected vulnerable populations and defended the institutions that made extraordinary opportunities possible for ordinary families. The story that had begun with a construction worker stopping to help a bullied child had become something larger and more complex, a reminder that individual choices could have consequences that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. Marcus and Emma's willingness to take risks for the right reasons had opened doors to a world of influence and responsibility that would shape not just their own futures, but the lives of people they would never meet. As the afternoon sun streamed through the bulletproof windows of their secure home, illuminating Isabella and Emma's shared laughter over their successful experiment, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. The luxury cars outside represented not just wealth and power, but safety and opportunity, proof that sometimes defending what's right leads to rewards beyond anything you dared to imagine. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.